Hello everyone and welcome. In this video I'll be giving 5 tips for metal rank players, so this includes bronze to plat, to improve in Overwatch. Now I'm aware that a lot of players that are in these ranks play the game casually and just want to have fun. However, this video is directed more towards someone who's really wanting to improve and get better. Before I begin, I want to mention that I'm no expert at the game and far from being a top tier player. Right now I'm just a hard stuck high masters player and can't even hit grandmaster. But my intention for this video is to provide some insight on a few key fundamentals in Overwatch that's often overlooked by metal ranks and casuals. So I'm just gonna get straight into it, starting with tip number 1, and that is to position yourself properly. I know that good positioning sounds cliche, but it's one of the most important things to consider if you want to improve as a player. One way to get a better understanding of proper positioning is to press tab and look at what the enemy team is running, then ask yourself, where can I position myself to reduce the hero's effectiveness? Let's say for example the enemy is running a Roadhog and you're getting hooked time and time again. The simplest solution to not get hooked is to first be mindful of where Roadhog is, play out of his hook range, and play around cover if you're in his hook range and need to dodge the hook. Now if you don't see Roadhog, you can expect him to be flanking or creating another angle of attack, or what's called off-angling. If you don't know his hook range, space yourself between you and him even more than that of what you think his hook range would be. Sometimes getting hooked is inevitable, and you'll see that during the second round of this game because stupid me started to tunnel vision. But my point here is to position yourself in a way to make the enemy work hard to get a kill on you. Another way of having better positioning is by using the map's geometry to your advantage. One of the easiest ways to get picks in Overwatch are killing players who are caught out in the open without using cover. Utilizing corners and natural cover is one of the easiest ways to avoid taking damage or dying. Let's say you're playing Genji and you want to do some poke damage. Instead of spamming shurikens out in the open, you can use cover during the delay of his primary fire to avoid taking damage. And this is just one of many ways you can use corners or cover. During this growing era of double off tank or ball hog tank duo craziness, utilizing cover and corners are even more important because you don't have a shield. If you happen to come across the hidden gems, which are the main tanks with a shield on your team, and you see that the shield is about to break, don't play directly behind the shield. Start looking for natural cover or a corner to play around, because if the shield does break and you're standing directly behind it, you're going to be exposed and be more vulnerable. One more thing I want to add to positioning is to use high ground as much as possible. There are many reasons why the high ground is so valuable, and some of these include a better viewing angle of the field, you expose less of your body to the enemy, and depending on what the enemy team is running, you can make their engagements more difficult since not all heroes have an ability to elevate themselves to the high ground. This can create more pressure on the enemy since they either have to find a way to force you off the high ground or spend their time and resources in trying to gain control of the high ground. When you use the high ground, you'll find that shooting, spamming damage, and landing certain abilities like anti-nades and dynamites are much easier compared to the low ground. By taking control and using the high ground, you're already giving yourself an advantage. So moving on to tip number 2, and that is to track enemy ultimates. Tracking ults is a valuable skill to learn if you're looking to improve. The reason why is because if you know which ults the enemy has, you can prepare to put yourself in an optimal position or to save a certain ability. Tracking ults can be difficult at first, so I'll give you some tips to become better at ult tracking. First, you want to be sure to press tab occasionally and quickly look at each hero from the enemy team and ask yourself if they have already used their ult. Be sure to pay attention to audio and visual cues of the enemy ults that are being used. If a teamfight hasn't been won by either side and has been going on for a long time without any ults used, you can expect the enemy to be near their ultimate or assume they have it. If you can get a feel that they have ults, start getting ready to prepare for those ults and try to position yourself properly and try to save necessary abilities to counter the ult. For example, let's say the enemy has a Genji and you're playing McCree. It's been 2 teamfights and you notice that their Genji hasn't used his ult yet. At this point, you can assume he has his ult, and it would probably be a good idea to save your flashbang and stay near your supports so you can stun him during the ult. Sometimes another way to tell if the enemy has ults is through their body language. For example, it's pretty obvious that Orion with Shatter is looking to ult if he starts playing really aggressive or is trying to line up the maximum number of enemies in front of him to land a fat Shatter. This happens often in the lower ranks as players are more predictable, so be sure to look out for signs like these. One more thing to keep in mind when it comes to ult tracking is gauging how fast an enemy can charge their ult. For example, the enemy has a Zarya at full charge and your team is running either a D.Va or a Roadhog. You can expect their Zarya to farm grab faster since both D.Va and Roadhog are ult batteries for a Zarya at full charge. And the third tip I have for you is to understand when you have an advantage. There are so many things I can go over about this topic, but I'll go over 2 concepts that I believe are important to capitalize on. The first concept is to claim space. So what is space and why do you want to be taking advantage of this space? I like to define space as the general distance or surface area that you have between your team and the enemy team. How much space you have is generally determined by the tanks on your team, but it can also be done through forcing enemies to move to another position, like a diva bomb for example, or to have enemies focus their attention on a pesky tracer in the backline. The easiest way I can explain that players are not taking advantage of this space is by constantly sitting on point in between team fights or when waiting for the enemies to respawn. Now this can be entirely situational depending on your team comp, the strategy you want to run, and the map. So as a general example, let's say you're attacking on King's Row and your team just captured first point while the enemy is spawning. What typically happens in the lower ranks is that the majority of the team will sit on the payload without moving up and claiming the free space. Instead, it would be better to have 1 or 2 players push the payload while the rest of the team pushes up to hold a corner and gain some map control. This same concept can also be done on the defending side while you wait for the enemies to respawn. It's not only important to take space during this time, but look for opportunities to punish tricklers or anyone who pushes too far up without grouping with their team. One more thing to look out for are enemies who got a bad spawn from dying early during a teamfight after a point capture on escort or hybrid game modes. The next thing that you should start paying attention to if you aren't already are enemy cooldowns. I know it's not possible to notice every single time an enemy uses one of their cooldowns, but it's important to do the best you can to take note of these things, and the reason why is because some heroes are more vulnerable if they don't have their abilities. Take this simple scenario as an example. The enemy has a high charge Zarya and you notice that she's playing in front of her Rein's shield, uses her personal bubble, and doesn't go back behind the shield or cover after her bubble breaks or expires. When this happens, you have a small window of time to try and focus her down because now she can't protect herself and she's exposed. Another example would be if you're playing Tracer, Genji, or Doomfist and you notice that the enemy Ana uses her sleep. Since she can't defend herself with her sleep for the next few seconds, it would be a good idea for you and your team to try and focus her down if you get the chance. This actually brings me to my next point, and that is ability usage. The way you use your abilities will be situational depending on the hero you're playing, what your team is running, and what your opponents are running. Being mindful of how and when you're going to use your abilities will make you a much more effective player than someone who's using their abilities every time it's off cooldown. I've explained this concept in my How to Play Ana video where I spoke about using Ana's abilities and how you don't want to just aimlessly use your nade and sleep every time it's off cooldown. Sometimes the way you want to use your abilities don't go as planned, and there will be times where you have to make split-second decisions in using your abilities, like trying to dodge an incoming hook with Ashe's coach gun for example. So at least, try to have an idea on how you're going to use your abilities to either defend yourself, help your team, or to counter the enemy. A big mistake I see a lot in the metal ranks are players who don't think twice about using their mobility cooldowns. At one point or another, you've probably witnessed a Winston, Genji, Diva, or Doomfist that put themselves in a bad situation and they end up feeding. Before deciding to go in using your mobility, make sure that your team will be able to follow up and don't go completely alone or stray too far from your team. One more thing to take note of if you're playing heroes who have mobility are any crowd control abilities that the enemy may have. Be sure to play around their stuns by having good positioning and have your non-mobility cooldowns like a Winston bubble or Genji deflect to help yourself get out of a bad situation. While we're on the topic of ability usage, I want to mention using ultimates. Just like abilities, using ults is situational. Knowing how and when to use your ult is key to winning teamfights and can be a big factor on which team will win based on how much value they're getting out of ults. What happens often in the metal ranks is that players wait too long before they use their ult. Whether that would be waiting too long for your teammate to farm an ult and combo, or waiting for the enemies to be in a tight group or certain position for you to press Q. Now I'm not saying to use your ult as soon as you get it, but instead start looking for an opportunity to use it because once you start holding on to ultimates for too long, the enemy's just going to use theirs and you're going to lose the teamfight. Think of your ultimate as another ability except way more powerful. Holding on to your ultimate is like not using your abilities, so it's really important to remember that ultimates will help you win teamfights if you're getting value out of it, just like using abilities to help you win a duel. Aside from trying to combo ults with teammates, you should look to use your ultimate to either initiate teamfights, as a zoning tool to buy time or create space, and to try to turn the teamfight around if 1 or 2 teammates die. Just be sure to not use your ultimate when most of your teammates are dead. Ultimates have a huge impact, so don't be afraid to use them and start getting creative on how you want to use it. And my final tip for you is to pay attention to the kill feed. I feel like a lot of lower tier players don't pay attention to the kill feed, and this leads to not knowing who is dead and who is alive both on their team and the enemy team. When you take a look at the kill feed, you'll notice that your game sense will increase just by knowing who is alive and who died. It's really important to know who has the advantage in numbers on both sides, and once you know, it can help you determine if a fight is winnable or not, whether you should ult or save it for the next fight, or to play passive or aggressive. Another thing to keep in mind is to know which enemies die during the fight. If you just killed the enemy Wrecking Ball or Tracer, you should expect them to come back faster from spawn, much faster than a Zen for example. Or if the enemy has snipers and they get picked, you have a little bit more freedom on where you can position yourself until they come back to the fight. Also, knowing exactly who is dead on your team is just as important. If your tanks die, there's going to be no one to either help protect the team, block damage, create space, or disrupt the enemy to help enable the DPS to do damage and get picks. If your DPS are dead, there's obviously going to be a lack of damage and pick potential, your tanks and supports will be taking on more pressure from the enemy, and there's going to be no one to help deal with the enemy DPS threats like snipers or flankers. And finally, if your supports are dead, the team won't have any healing or utility to survive a team fight. All of the roles are interdependent to each other, and if you lose one or both players from each role, your team is going to be at a big disadvantage and is going to have a harder time dealing with the enemy. You can know who died on your team by not only looking at the kill feed, but also by looking at the visual indication on screen where your teammate died. So I know I went on a bit of a tangent, but it's important to have a general understanding of all the roles and how they fit into the team. Looking at the kill feed will prevent the confusion of wondering where your teammates of a specific role are, so do your best to look at the top right of the screen during a team fight when you get the chance. So if you made it this far into the video, I actually have a bonus tip to add, and that is to limit the amount of losses you want to take. What works best for me personally is if I either lose 2 ranked games in a row or lose 2 games overall, I stop playing ranked. This works for me because then I won't get frustrated by continuous losses and I get to keep some of the SR that I've gained. So let's say you've played 6 games of ranked, 3 of which you win and 3 you lose. You pretty much made no progress and you're stuck in the same place from where you started. Of course, this method of playing ranked isn't necessary, but you should consider it if you're serious about climbing and gaining SR. That's it for me, and I hope this video will help you in your ranked games. If you'd like to see more content, be sure to subscribe and leave a like. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.